Good afternoon, everyone. This is a critical, definitive, acceleration, and transformative movement and moment in America's civil rights movement for racial, gender, orientation, economic, and judicial equality. I am President Robinson, and I am the President and CEO of the National Bar Association. We must move boldly and deliberately to seek for every American equal justice under the law, liberty and happiness, the pursuit of happiness, freedom from violence, economic, social, and political equity, and to also save this republic. As you know, we are in the midst of two horrific pandemics. One pandemic was caused and is still caused by COVID-19 and a very incompetent White House administration. The other pandemic is caused by systemic, historic, institutional, and structural racial inequality. That systemic racism has resulted in the death and torture of African Americans by police and vigilantes. We are still mourning the death of George Floyd, Rashid Brooks, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others. There's a strong demand and passion for reform, the subject of this panel. We have the privilege of the participation of the Honorable Representative Hakeem Jeffries. Representative Jeffries, thank you for being here. We welcome you, and it is my extraordinary privilege and delight to introduce you. Representative Hakeem Jeffries represents the diverse 8th Congressional District of New York, an area that encompasses large parts of Brooklyn and a section of Queens. Serving his 4th term in the United States Congress, Representative Jeffries is a member of the powerful House Judiciary Committee and House Budget Committee. Like me, as I've indicated earlier, we both hail from Brooklyn, New York. Representative Jeffries is the chairman of the House Democratic Caucus. And in that capacity, he is the 5th highest ranking Democrat in the House of Representatives. In Congress, Representative Jeffries has emerged as a tireless advocate for social and economic justice. He has worked hard to reform our criminal justice system, to improve the economy for every American, and to protect our health care. Representative Jeffries will address legislative efforts, and in particular, HR 7278 to improve and reform policing practices, accountability, and transparency. With that, I turn over the virtual podium to our honored guest, Representative Jeffries.
Thank you very much, President Robinson. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you. I'm thankful for your leadership, to Madam President-elect, to the distinguished members of this panel. It's just an honor to be able to deliver brief opening remarks. I'm going to try to follow the advice of a former Sunday school teacher of mine growing up in the Cornerstone Baptist Church in Bedford-Stuyvesant, who once said to me, "Jeffries, on the question of public speaking, be brief, be bright, and be gone." And so I'm going to try to step out of the way after some brief remarks, because this is such a distinguished panel of individuals, including a couple of members of the Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity incorporated, who I'm always blessed to be in the presence of brothers of that noble clan. That said, this is a moment of reckoning in America as we are dealing with these twin crises that our president laid out. A pandemic that has wreaked a lot of pain, suffering, and death on the American people, disproportionately adversely impacting the African American community. as well as a reckoning around the question of racism, which has been in the soil of this country since before America was America, 401 years. And we are now at a moment where it's an all hands on deck approach at the city, state, and federal government level, an all of America approach. And that's why I continue to be thankful for the advocacy, the leadership, the skill, the capacity of the National Bar Association. Black lawyers have played such a critical role in our freedom journey for such a long time. And you all are continuing that great tradition. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act was advanced by the House Judiciary Committee on Wednesday, and it includes several elements that we in the Congressional Black Caucus have been working on for years. It will prohibit the chokehold and other strangulation tactics, such as a knee to the neck, as a matter of law, because we believe that these procedures are inherently dangerous, unnecessary, unacceptable, uncivilized, unconscionable, and un-American. We're going to make it unlawful. We also will prohibit no-knock warrants in drug cases in order to avert tragedies such as the killing of Breonna Taylor. We will establish a national database so that there is visibility into officers who have engaged in brutal, violent behavior and been disciplined and terminated. So we can avoid a situation where officers go from one department to a neighboring department without the second police department having any visibility into that officer's history. That's what happened with the murder of Tamir Rice, who was fired by a neighboring police department for brutal behavior, and then hired by the Cleveland Police Department, who had no visibility into this officer's history. And so we established a national database in that regard. We will end the doctrine of qualified immunity for police officers, because in America, you cannot have a right under our nation's civil rights laws pursuant to Section 1983 without a real remedy if qualified immunity as a doctrine has been read to apply to officers and exempt them from liability if they behave in a manner consistent with the least reasonable officer on the force. Now, can you imagine if, as a member of Congress, I was held to the standard of the least reasonable member of the House of Representatives? I'd be run out of Brooklyn quickly. And the notion that you can have police officers held to such a low standard when they have the ability to take someone's life or liberty makes no sense. We will end racial profiling under law by prohibiting it explicitly. And we will do several other things designed to bring about accountability so that we can shift the law enforcement mentality from a warrior approach, which sees community members far too often as enemy combatants, to a guardian approach in order to strengthen the relationship between law enforcement and our community. So we will move this legislation out of the House of Representatives and debate it next Thursday, send it over to the Senate, and hold the Senate accountable. So it's so appropriate that you've chosen to hold this panel discussion on Juneteenth. We've come a long way in America. We still have a long way to go as it relates to full and complete freedom. We want freedom from the chokehold. We want freedom from a knee on our neck. We want freedom from police abuse, from police violence, from police brutality. We want freedom from abusive no-knock warrants. We want freedom from harassment. We just want the right to be able to breathe the same free air of liberty and justice for all. And I'm so thankful for what the National Bar Association, for what all of these distinguished panelists do to advance the cause of justice and continue our long, necessary, and majestic march toward a more perfect union. So God bless all of you. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to share some opening remarks, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you. Representative. It was very powerful of you, and thank you for your work on this bill. Let us know whatever we can do to help push it through. Our members are ready to do what we need to do to correct this injustice. Mr. Moderator, I turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Madam President. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carlos Moore, and I'm the managing partner of the Cochran firm, Mississippi Delta. We welcome you to this virtual town hall discussion on this historic occasion, Juneteenth. This panel is brought to you by the National Bar Association's Police Misconduct and Justice Task Force, of which I'm a member. We have a distinguished panel here today. We'll be talking about the road to reform, equity, and freedom. What is reform? Reform means to make changes in something, typically a social, political, or economic institution or practice in order to improve it. What is equity? The quality of being fair and impartial. Equity is giving everyone what they need to be successful, including proportional representation by race, class, or gender. What is freedom? Freedom is the state of not being imprisoned or enslaved. It's quite simply liberty. While we are no longer physically shackled, we are still not totally free from the bondage and chains of white supremacy. So we have this historic convening today, and we're going to discuss the road to reform, equity, and freedom. We have 6 distinguished panelists, starting with our 77th President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Bar Association, Dean Alfreda Robinson. Dean Robinson was installed as the 77th President of the National Bar Association on July the 25th, 2019, at the 94th Annual NBA Convention in New York City. Founded in 1925, the National Bar Association is the oldest and largest national organization of primarily African American and minority lawyers, judges, law professors, and students. President Robinson is the 13th female president in the nearly 100-year existence of the National Bar Association. She professionally is the Associate Dean for Trial Advocacy and co-director of the Litigation and Dispute Resolution Program at the George Washington University Law School. Scholarly, she has written extensively about reparations. So we look forward to her discussion this afternoon about reparations and the path forward there. Welcome, President Robinson.
Thank you.
Our next distinguished panelist is the President-elect of the National Bar Association, none other than Attorney C.K. Hoffler. C.K. is a seasoned trial lawyer and the CEO of the C.K. Hoffler firm, a trilingual law firm. She speaks fluently English, French, and Spanish. Her law firm is based in Atlanta, Georgia. She specializes in commercial litigation, opioid litigation, catastrophic injury, civil rights, global commercial transactions, medical negligence, wrongful death, and employment cases. She's licensed in Georgia, Florida, Virginia, DC, and Pennsylvania. She takes the helm of the National Bar Association on July the 29th, next month. Welcome to the President-elect. Our next distinguished panelist hails from the great state of Nevada. It's none other than the Nevada Attorney General, Aaron Ford. General Ford was sworn in as Nevada's 34th Attorney General in 2019, and he is the first African-American to take statewide constitutional office. Before being elected as Attorney General, A.G. Ford served as the Majority Leader of the Nevada State Senate. He also previously served in many leadership capacities during his time in the Senate, including as the Minority Leader, Assistant Majority Whip, and the Vice Chair of the Judicial Committee. Welcome, General Ford.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our next distinguished panelist hails from the great state of Delaware, the Honorable Darius J. Brown, Delaware State Senator. Senator Brown took office in 2018, and he represents the 2nd Senatorial District. He is just the 3rd African-American in the history of Delaware to serve in the Delaware State Senate, and he is the youngest African-American elected to that chamber. Senator Brown serves as the chair of the Senate Judicial Committee, vice chair of Corrections and Public Safety, a member of the Capital Improvement Committee, and chair of the Delaware Legislative Black Caucus. Senator Brown is the sponsor of the Adult Expungement Reform Act, one of the most exhaustive and comprehensive expungement reform bills in the country. He's created pathways out of poverty and expanded economic opportunity during his term or tenure in public life. Welcome, Senator Brown.
Thank you for having me.
Professor Alvin Bragg is our next distinguished guest. He too is a New Yorker, as many of our panelists have indicated. He's a son of Central Harlem and a husband and father raising 2 children there. Professor Bragg has spent the better of 2 decades in the courtroom, standing up to the powerful and fighting to get justice. Most recently, Alvin served as the Chief Deputy Attorney General in New York State, where he oversaw some of the office's biggest cases, including suing Harvey Weinstein and his company for the existence of a hostile work environment and challenging the Trump administration over the census. Professor Bragg also serves as the first chief of a special unit that investigated police-involved killings, and as an assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of New York, where he successfully prosecuted corrupt politicians and an FBI agent for making false statements. He is now a visiting professor of law at New York Law School and co-director of its Racial Justice Project. Welcome, Professor Bragg.
Thank you.
Last but not least is my good brother of Kappa Alpha Psi, Dr. Wes Bellamy. Dr. Wes Bellamy is the author of Monumental, It Was Never About a Statue. He is a former vice mayor and city councilman in Charlottesville, Virginia. He's the chairman of the political science department at Virginia State University and one of the leading global thought leaders of the millennial generation. Dr. Bellamy is the managing partner of New Emergence Consulting, an equity and policy consulting firm, and the National Public Policy Chairman of the 100 Black Men of America. He is the youngest individual to ever be elected to a Charlottesville City Council, and he came into the national spotlight after helping to lead the effort to remove statues of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson from city parks. Welcome, Dr. Bellamy. All right, so I believe everyone in the stratosphere and the virtual stratosphere will agree that these panelists are very much distinguished. So let's just get right to it and talk about the road to reform, equity, and freedom. Professor Bragg, you're first up. Can you tell us your thoughts about the Justice and Policing Act as described by Congressman Jeffries that's been introduced in the House, and maybe compare that to what has been proposed in the Senate, and then whatever that was that number 45 came up with the other day with the executive order?
Definitely, thank you so much. And it's a important, groundbreaking piece of legislation. And Congressman Jeffries did a great job, obviously, with an overview, so I don't want to retread there. You know, what 45 came forward with, let's just sit it to the side, because it's obfuscation. He did that to distract from the goal of moving forward this important bill. And as Congressman Jeffries said, I think that the issue will be once it comes out of the House dealing with the Senate. And so I don't know, because that's not sort of my domain to know whether it will pass there, but as someone who's sort of worked at the federal, state, and local levels, what I like a lot about the bill, in addition to hopefully it passing at the federal level, is it provides a model for language at the state level. So for example, the chokehold provision that Representative Jeffries talked about, Last week in New York, no coincidence, our state legislature banned the chokehold. Our city council also is taking up a provision on it. And so I think as we talk about all of the above approach, both legislatively and obviously protest activity and litigation, in terms of the bill, what I would like to see is other jurisdictions take up key language. And so I'll just point out a few. As many people watching will know, the standard that we assess officers for in terms of use of force comes in many jurisdictions from the Graham versus Connor case, which in my view, having investigated a lot of these cases, it is overly deferential to the police, particularly as it is explained to juries. The new bill in Congress would change for federal officers to a last resort. Basically, a police officer can only kill you if it's their last resort. I think that's got a lot of intuitive force and should be the law. But if the Senate doesn't pass it and doesn't get signed, I would hope that folks would take this back to their states and their localities. And we know that the overwhelming majority of the criminal justice system is at the local and state level. So that's one provision that I would hold up and hope that we can sort of universalize through the states. Another is Congressman Jeffries talked about this registry of national misconduct. I mean, this is a huge issue. He mentioned Tamir Rice. We just do not nationwide have enough visibility into the pasts of these officers. You look at the officer who killed George Floyd, Officer Pantaleo in New York who killed Eric Garner, and they both had a history of complaints against them. And in New York, we had until last week a very protective statute that hid that conduct from the public. That veil has been lifted, and I think it's no mistake we see these things moving forward at the same time. It's the same time that the federal bill calls for a national registry. At our state level in New York, we've repealed the law, taking a step forward to transparency. And then just yesterday, our mayor here in New York said that he's going to put that into a database online so it'll be searchable. We have to hold his feet to the fire to make sure that happens. But that's another example of the federal, state, and local levels kind of complementing one another, right? If we passed that in the state and did that in New York, that would be great for us to know here, but an officer coming from somewhere else to here, we wouldn't know. So that's why we need the federal legislation to complement that. So those are a couple provisions. And the last one I'll note, and then I'll stop because we've got so many more learned people than me. The accreditation standards. You know, we're all admitted to practice law. You know, we had to pass an exam. We got to do continuing legal education. We don't have a national standard. We've got, I think 800,000 police departments in the country. It's a very high number. And there's no national baseline for what makes a police department, what makes a police officer. So the bill in Congress does that through an incentive system, creates a national accreditation standard. That's very important, again, as we think about how localities, states, and the federal government interact. So why don't I leave it there? I will just end. You started with New York. I'm proud, a Harlemite, but I do want to say hello to Dr. Bellamy. I hope he's sitting in Petersburg, Virginia, where Virginia State is, because both my parents are from there. So we're all together, brother.
Hail State.
All right. Well, thanks, Professor Bragg, for starting us off with the discussion about the Justice and Policing Act and what's going on at the federal level. We have two distinguished gentlemen here that represent and active participants in state government in their various states. So we're going to turn it at this point to General Ford, who's the Attorney General, the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the state of Nevada, and he'll be followed by our state senator there in Delaware, Senator Brown. The floor is yours, General Ford. What are your thoughts on things we can do on state level?
Well, first off, thank you so much to the NBA for convening this panel and this discussion. I believe you would agree with me that conversation is great, but the time for conversing should be near an end, if not over. And what we're seeing now are opportunities to see ideas manifested in state law and in policy to help improve relationships between law enforcement and the communities in which they serve, specifically in this instance, the Black community. As the top law enforcement official in my state, you see my pendant here. This is a replica of my badge. I have a badge, and I recognize that I have a responsibility as a member of law enforcement, but I am also a Black man. And I've been a Black man all my life, a Black man before I became Attorney General, and will be a Black man once I am done being Attorney General. And so I have a unique intersection especially as a top law enforcement officer in this state, with being Black and in law enforcement, to be able to speak to some issues that are prevalent throughout society, have been prevalent for years, and look to be a bridge in that conversation, but beyond conversation in the implementation of solutions. At the statewide level, one of the things that I am glad about, and you've heard Congressman, my frat brother as well, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries mention that the act that he's working on has a lot of great provisions in it. One of which I am very excited about. It's going to be in an amendment, as I understand it. Both Senator Kamala Harris and Representative Bass have communicated that they are working to include the ability for local law enforcement officers, specifically state attorneys general, to institute what's called pattern and practice investigations. And those would be the types of investigations undertaken when there are allegations of police mistreatment of particular communities, specifically in a discriminatory way. In my state, I don't currently have that capability. Those issues are, in the first instance, provided to other entities and other agencies. I think that providing that at the national level, but also I've requested of my state legislature to provide it at the state level, provides an additional level of oversight and accountability in these types of circumstances, such that when we hear claims of discriminatory treatment, we can subpoena, we can get data, we can analyze data, and if required, we can institute action to remedy those situations. I think at the state level, that's a very important component to helping bridge the lack of trust that currently exists between law enforcement and certain communities. I've always said that there are at least three types of communities, one of which is that community that has utmost belief in government, and particularly law enforcement. You've seen this on TV before, where if a law enforcement officer is on the stand testifying in court, then what he's saying is Bible. And anybody who testifies against him or says something contrary must be lying. That's a level of trust that certain communities have in law enforcement. There's another level of trust that where people had that level of trust, but it's diminished at some level only maybe because of an interaction, a personal interaction, or a vicarious interaction that they've seen take place. And that trust has been diminished at some level, but they still see the good in law enforcement. Then there are communities, frankly, like the ones from which I hail, that had no trust in law enforcement. While we welcomed them when bad things were happening in our neighborhood, sometimes bad things happened when they came to our neighborhood. And we want to be able to create trust in those instances. And so the three communities that I want to work toward improving trust in are those three. And my capacity as Attorney General, I say we need to be augmenting trust where it already exists. We should be restoring trust where it's been diminished, and that we should be working to create trust where it's never existed in the first place. And pattern and practice gives us the ability to hold agencies accountable, but it also gives us the opportunity to exonerate them if there are false accusations or allegations held toward them. It's the flip side of the same coin that's also quite important. And then the last thing that I'll say before I turn the mic back to you is that I've also requested that my office have concurrent jurisdiction or some level of jurisdiction to actually prosecute officers if necessary. Right now, that falls to the first instance to the local district attorney. And I've spoken with some district attorneys, and they understand the intricacies of human interactions, such that sometimes they are loath to bring cases because they have to work with these detectives. Being one step removed from working with those detectives on a daily basis, I believe that my Office of Attorney General and other offices of Attorney General may have the ability to bring justice where it otherwise would not be seen. So those are a couple of examples that I think can happen at the state level to help bridge this gap and to bring some solutions to the conversation.
All right, well, I appreciate that, General Ford. You gave us a lot of good gems, a wealth of knowledge for what can be done and is being done to a certain extent on the state level, especially where you are. One of the things that you mentioned likely will take some legislation to give you concurrent jurisdiction. And so we're going to turn it over to our legislative member, panelist, Senator Brown. What's going on over there in Delaware? And do y'all have something similar or some legislation pending?
Thank you for having me. And in the midst of all the Kappas that got caught up in a cold winter, it's good to have some light. So to all my Alpha brothers that are there watching, I'm glad I got some company this afternoon. But you know, Delaware is in a unique position, and we have a unique history that is even highlighted even more on a day like today, which is Juneteenth. Delaware is one of 2 states that seceded from the Union, Delaware and Kentucky. And so slavery was not abolished in Delaware until the 13th Amendment was ratified in December of 1865. And so with that context, last week, the Delaware Legislative Black Caucus announced our Justice for All agenda. And the first piece of legislation on that agenda is SB 191, Senate Bill 191, which is an amendment to the Delaware Constitution that adds race, color, and national origin as protected classes within the Delaware Constitution. That legislation passed its first leg in Delaware State Senate unanimously this past week. It's now going to the House next week for its first leg of passage, and then we'll return in January for the 151st session of the General Assembly. We'll pass it in second leg, and then it will become part of the Delaware Constitution. In addition to that, we are also sponsoring legislation addressing chokehold legislation, also working with our state police department and our governor around the publication of mugshots for children. And so since last Wednesday, when we had our press conference, there's been a lot of progress where our governor announced yesterday by executive order that they were going to prohibit the Delaware State Police from publishing juveniles' photos for offenses. Also yesterday, the governor announced that today for Juneteenth, state offices will be closed. So there's a lot of progress that has been made since the caucus's announcement last week, with very similar legislation that we've seen around the country and other states. I would just admonish those that are watching and listening today to contact their local legislators. For all the attorneys that are part of NBA, to be engaged in contact legislators, your local Black caucuses in your state, to make sure that they're also sponsoring similar legislation that is in Delaware, New York, and Nevada, and other states, so that we can continue to make this progress that is so important. And so that's why I wanted to open up in the context of, we have a favorite son in Delaware who just so happens to be running for president of the United States. And so as people hear him give his story about Delaware, I wanted to give some context today to the audience that Delaware is a state that has a deep history in America's slavery and all of those things. And so as we look at how we're transitioning and changing in our country, we can look at the progress we're currently making in Delaware around legislation as a model for others. So thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you, Senator Brown. Let me ask you this. Does the Delaware Attorney General have concurrent jurisdiction to prosecute police extrajudicial killings?
Yes. In Delaware, yeah, we don't have district attorneys or anything like that in Delaware.
Okay,
yeah.
So the prosecutor, okay. So that's different in some other states. I know in Mississippi, the local district attorney would have to recuse himself and ask the state attorney general to step in and prosecute, and it's possible for the state AG to then step in once asked, but there's no concurrent jurisdiction. If someone recuses, then the AG steps in. And we recently had a situation where we had a young Black man, one of the first African-American district attorneys in that district. He stepped aside where there was an white individual that killed a young Black man. He stepped aside and asked the Democratic AG, Jim Hood, to investigate and prosecute. That Democratic AG successfully got a grand jury indictment against the officer for murder. There was an election, and unfortunately, Jim Hood did not win the governorship, and he's out of office. A Republican became attorney general, and she decided that despite what the grand jury said, she didn't think there was enough evidence to go forward with the prosecution, and she had the case dismissed without prejudice. I mean, so there's going to be no justice. So even when you recuse yourself, sometimes politics still gets into play at the AG's level. So, and I've never heard of someone going up above and beyond what the grand jury decided. There should have been a trial, but such is life. Someone told me that our politics is local. So we're gonna go down to the local level. Dr. Bellamy was the vice mayor of Charlottesville, and I'm here, and he's a millennial, and I'm hearing a lot of talk about defunding the police. What is all that about, Dr. Bellamy?
Well, thanks again for having me, good brother, and I appreciate all the esteemed panelists. Defunding the police is a term that has gotten a great deal of attention throughout the country, and I know it's been one that's been polarizing for a wide variety of reasons. I'll say as a former elected official, I've been hearing about this for some time, and initially I thought that it was one of the most ludicrous ideas that I've ever heard of, and I essentially thought defund was was synonymous with abolish, and the two are not. So for me, I'm a supporter of defund the police, and for the following reasons. I've had countless discussions and conversations with individuals who are of the law enforcement profession, police officers and so forth, and I've been told on a continuous and consistent basis, Wes, we are not equipped to be social workers. We are not equipped to be mental health advocates. When we go on these calls, I have to be a parent, I have to be a social worker, I have to be a mental health professional, a psychiatrist, all in one, and it takes a toll on me. So when I look at that, and I even look at the budgets, and we're all very politically astute persons, if you just look at your municipality's budget and you look at how much of that is being allocated to the police, I am willing to bet $10 to a nickel, as my grandmother would say, that the large majority of that budget is going to police and law enforcement or such. What the defund the police movement is advocating for is to reduce police budgets and then increase the amount of resources that are going towards mental health services, social services, and things of that nature. In my opinion, there needs to be a move from policing, and there needs to be a movement towards public safety. And the two are not synonymous. There's a major difference in the two. I don't need, and many of our communities don't need to be policed. Now, does that mean that there is no need or no room for the police? I disagree with that. I think there is a room and there is space for law enforcement and public safety, but I don't think that we have to be policed. When you look at some of these communities, i.e. middle class, higher class, upper class income based or socioeconomic communities, you will see many of them with a large amount of resources, a small amount of police traffic, and you have more opportunities. So how is it in low-income communities, and many of which look like the people who are on this Zoom call, you have a high number of police interaction, you have very few resources, and you have very few amenities. Those things have to be flip-flopped or switched. And if we want our communities to move forward, if we want to envision or see a world in which Black people specifically are being treated like human beings opposed to being treated like animals, then we have to move again towards public safety, community policing, and again, we have to defund the police. Let's reallocate those resources to get them into the hands of people who can actually help our communities opposed to who are policing our communities. Sorry, President.
All right, well, Dr. Bell, I'm glad you elaborated on what exactly it means. I'm above 40 now, so when I first heard, I'm like, defund the police? What are they talking about? I mean, you're about 10 years younger than me. I'm like, they didn't lost their minds. But now that you explained it, it makes a lot of sense. I thought I was just getting old, but I was like, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But it's not dismantling police. It's just reappropriating some of the funds for other much needed things in the community.
Yeah, I'm not a proponent for abolishing the police, disbanding the police in any shape, form, or fashion. There is a role for public safety. But again, even the language and the vernacular that we use, policing has a certain connotation within a wide variety of communities. Public safety is something completely different. And I think that there's a role for public safety in our schools. There's a role for public safety in our communities. But policing, again, is different. So why can't we just shift those resources? I think it's more than capable. And we've seen it happen in Camden, New Jersey. We've seen it happen in other municipalities and cities across the country. We just have to challenge ourselves to be bold enough to think outside of the norm.
Got it. So when these situations happen, police brutality, another unarmed Black man or woman is killed, the family has to turn to an attorney to get justice, some semblance of justice. And a lot of the times, the attorney that the family members turn to are members of the National Bar Association. So now we're going to turn to our president-elect, C.K. Hoffler, who has some current cases and has been a long-time civil rights leader, been very active and currently the chairman of the Rainbow Push Coalition Board And she's going to talk about her experiences as a practitioner and representing individuals of their families after individuals have been killed by the police. Madam President-elect.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you to Madam President of the NBA for your phenomenal job in assembling this task force that's resulted in this seminar or this town hall. And Carlos, thank you for doing a magnificent job of pulling this together. And for all the distinguished panelists, it's an honor to be a part of this panel, but also it's an honor to talk about these issues that are plaguing our nation. I believe we have 3 pandemics. We have COVID, we have the police brutality, excessive use of force, and we also have election suppression. But I'm going to leave the 3rd one aside and come back to it as I conclude my comments. In terms of my experience, I have represented Rainbow Push and Reverend Jesse Jackson for 32 of my 33 years as a lawyer. So I have been entrenched in civil rights issues for most of my professional career. And that has been a badge of honor. That's been a labor of love to represent, of course, our civil rights icons. In the process, I've seen so much destruction and devastation throughout this country at the hands of discrimination because of police brutality and because of other forms of discrimination. I recall representing Jaisha Scott, a young girl you may remember about 15 years ago. She was 5 at the time in Florida, acting out in class, and she was handcuffed, and taken out to a police car, in the police car for 3.5 hours awaiting her mother, and shackles were on her feet. That's what many people don't realize. Shackles were on her feet. So that experience many years ago, in addition to being when I was in practice with Willie Gary, one of his law partners, running part of his discrimination on civil rights practice, having the experience of being one of the lawyers with the late Johnny Cochran, Charles Ogletree, many, probably some people on this call, filing the reparations litigation in Oklahoma. And I know that our president can speak to that, as she is a scholar on that in those areas. But having seen recent events here in Atlanta, I am originally from Buffalo, so I'm a New Yorker too, have family in Buckingham County, Virginia, but I live in Atlanta. And what we have seen unfold in Atlanta every single day, there's another act of violence, police brutality, abuse. And we have an extraordinary mayor who's taking the bull by the horn and putting in place measures to address it. Make no mistake about it. As a practitioner, what I've seen, and I say practitioner, doing civil rights and handling some of these cases over the years, I am first delighted that every single one of these cases is handled by a National Bar Association board. Every single one right now on the national stage. Leadership of the National Bar, leadership of our affiliate chapters, Ben Crump, Darrell Parks, past presidents of the NBA, Chris Stewart, a past president of an affiliate chapter of the NBA, an active NBA member, all of the people that we have seen on the stage right now. And that is extraordinary because we have, as has been said before, been at the forefront. Recently, I got a case that came into my office, and when I say recently, I mean as in the past week, of a young man who was incarcerated and who was beaten while incarcerated, while the officer, beaten by an officer, yelling, "Black lives don't matter," using the N-word, and saying, "What are you gonna do now? You gonna protest?" So this is the kind of backlash that's happening, that we're seeing throughout this country. That's just one of many cases that we're seeing. Here in Atlanta, police officers walking off the job in solidarity with the officers who shot, the officer who shot and killed a Black man. So these officers standing in solidarity because the officers, 2 officers were arrested. See this, we have got to bring about change. Enough is enough. And the only way to do it is what we're doing now. Protesting. I don't condone the violence, but protesting absolutely, as it is our right to protest. Pushing for legislative change. We heard Congressman Jeffries earlier speak about the change, the legislative measures on a state level. We have to hold our elected officials feet to the fire. And finally, remember that 3rd pandemic I talked about? Election suppression, voter suppression. We must refuse to be denied and insist that we vote. I just went through that horror of I don't even know how to describe it, of what we did when we were voting last week in Georgia. I don't know how to describe it because what should have taken 10 minutes for me to vote, it should have taken 10 minutes, took 4.5 hours. Machines weren't working, not enough paper ballots, just horrific conditions that we would think actually that we would not see anywhere else in the world, to be perfectly frank. We would not see what happened in Georgia, in the Atlanta metropolitan area. We would not see that anywhere else in the world. And this happened in Wisconsin, it's happened in Pennsylvania, it's happened in a lot of different places. Enough is enough. So the only way to bring about change is by police reform, as we advocate at the NBA, but also by voting. It's important to vote. It's critical to vote. I may have looked like an alien with all the apparatus that I had on, the mask with a protective shield and the hat and gloves and all of this, and I looked some kind of way voting, but in 80 or 90 degree weather, but I was determined to vote no matter how long it took. And that's got to be the determination, whether it's voting by mail, absentee ballot. Many people were there in Atlanta voting by absentee that had been promised absentee ballots and never got them. Wanted to vote by mail, were never able to. So when I look at police reform and what we're discussing today, it's a trifecta for me. We can't talk about this without talking about COVID, because COVID is driving how the protests are manifesting themselves and people's awareness, people's alertness. The police brutality that's been happening in our communities forever actually never stopped happening. During slavery, it happened. Lynchings happened during slavery, during Jim Crow. Even when Jim Crow was outlawed, during the civil rights movement, the same thing was happening over and over and over again, which is why this movement for reparations is important, which is why this movement for police reform is important and critical, which is why election suppression cannot stand. So as a practitioner, it is an honor for me to represent people who have no voice, people whose families have suffered because their loved ones have been killed or have been injured at the hands of law enforcement, excessive use of force. Enough is enough. We must have accountability, and we must hold the feet of our elected officials to the fire when it comes to implementing the change that we must have for this country to be able to stand up and be held accountable. Enough is enough.
All right, enough is enough. We appreciate those words and comments from our President-elect, C.K. Hoffler. We could stay on reform all day. There's so much to discuss in the areas of police reform, but Rome was not built in a day. This is the road to reform, and so it's going to be a long and winding road, but a lot of the comments have let us know the path forward and what we have to do to get to that final promised land. Let's move into the area of equity, and we're going to bring our president, Alfreda Robinson. She is a scholar in the area of reparations, and being a man of faith, I've always been told there can be no forgiveness without atonement. It is time that America pays up for the 400 years of oppression they put us through. Madam President, how can we get reparations?
Well, reparation has been, of course, debated for many, many years. I wrote an article which did a pivot, not focusing on reparations from the federal government or any state government, but rather from the corporations that profited during the slave trade and other institutions, that they would contribute the funding for reparations. It is a political calculus. It's an economic discussion. Who's going to pay for it? Can we afford to pay for it? And then on the political side, it's one of those things that make people uneasy. And I heard all the arguments. My article is in my name, and it's called Corporate Reparations Jubilee. And I talked about that, as you will know, as you say, you're a student of, you're a biblical scholar, that at the end of a 7-year period, you would just return to someone that which had been given to you. We have not had our reparations. We were brought to this country to work for free. We were never brought to this country to earn a living. So you got to have that basic understanding. And so we worked for years as the owned property of slave owners. And then when slavery was over, we were not deemed to be worthy of a salary or a job that would allow us to live like others. So when we talk about the pursuit of happiness, which is for me a big deal, have we lived the way other Americans, white Americans, have been able to live? Because other people of color have had this same problem. We have not been able to fully, pursue happiness in this country. And systematically, every single system, every structure had baked in the divisions based on race, based on gender. And so to come out of that system, there was the push for reparations. The arguments that have been made is, well, you had reparations because you had it as affirmative action. Well, that's a fallacy, because affirmative action, although it lifted people like us, did not take the whole bottom of, and every single African American did not lift it up. And then the argument was made, well, you and your children should not get reparations because you don't need it. Well, reparations is built upon going back generations and looking to who landed in America involuntarily, and who your ancestor was again brought here to work for free and was tortured and maimed and murdered and was simply commodity for the slave owner. So it doesn't matter who ended up middle class or upper class, that it's still, we began here all the same. We're viewed the same. And so reparations, the argument being, okay, fine, I'll give half of my check back. I won't take a check, the wealthiest African Americans. But that doesn't mean you don't still believe as Americans that at some point there should be reparations paid to African Americans so that they can be brought to equity or parity with every other group in America. Brown people as well. Let's not get that twisted. But we have seen reparations paid to other groups for wrongs. So now we're in a system in America where after all of these years, the disparity is still stark. It's still stark across every sector: housing, education, health, home ownership, entrepreneurship. In every category, we find ourselves at the bottom. So that's why the call for reparations is still a live one. And America just has to decide how we're going to have the conversation and who's going to pay it. The owners of the slave ships that profited, transported Africans from the motherland here, the universities that use slaves to build their structures, and other sources that we could look at. But it's a delicate, it's time for America. It's a delicate issue to people. I'm not a racist. I'm a liberal. I have, Black friends. This is nothing whatsoever to do with you personally, because you were not a slave owner. Otherwise, you would have already passed away, we hope. But although there's some modern day slavery, we'll save that for another panel, Mr. Moderator. But certainly, it is not about that. It's the structure, looking at the structure and how you repair the structure. And in that sense, do you have to look at the fact that we have to give cash, not just opportunities, cash to the descendants of slaves.
Madam President, you have really, as the old folks would say, blessed my heart to hear you talk so intelligently about reparations and make the case for it so succinctly. It's something that we definitely need, and something that we deserve. I mean, we have built this country and we have not been paid, and you cannot just gloss over it and go and just have a successful country. You have to have atonement. And so the road to race relations getting where they need to be in this country is going to go through reparations. Once we are taken care of, we are paid what's due us. Like the Jews receive the reparations, the Japanese receive theirs. When it comes to African Americans, it's time out for asking. It's time to demand justice and to demand what's rightly due to us. And so I'm glad that you made the case. I know Bob Johnson, the founder of BET, he said that we deserve $14 trillion. Maybe $300,000 per African American. That'd be a great start. So that's the beginning of a discussion. But it's time we stop discussing it and get to action. I know there was a Senate bill or some senators saying let's have a panel or a group to discuss it. But it's time out for discussing. Let's get some action and get some equity. We are 400.
As the President-elect said, it's at the ballot box. It's at the local, it's at the state, it's at the federal level. So we can stop talking about it. Go to the ballot box and vote your interest. If you disagree with reparations, you don't have to vote for that person. But if you feel that there's some inequity that is lingering, that you can say it's not happenstance, that it's structural, what can we do? Then you could put that question to whoever the candidate is, and you can make your decision at the ballot box.
And then you have to decide which candidate of the two that's running for the highest office in the land, the most powerful job in the world, is going to not only be equitable to African Americans in general, but to women in particular. Which candidate is going to put a Black woman on the U.S. Supreme Court, who's pledged to do so? Which candidate potentially will have a Black female running mate? Someone that's going to give us parity and equity across the board, African American men and women. So consider all of that at the voting booths. If that's not important to you, you know who to vote for. But if it's important for you and to you, you know who to vote for. So equity, it's a long, long road to get there. I like something that the senator in Delaware, Senator Brown, did with the adult expungement bill. Tell us why you led that effort and what that entailed.
Thank you, Judge Moore. Let me just anecdotally had the privilege of the floor with Madam President's comments and just say, okay. I think you said Delaware. I think the answer to what you said was Delaware. It's a guy that's from Delaware. I think that's what you said. And so I say that in context because what we know is by the year 2050, the country will become a majority minority country. And also by the year 2050, the average net worth of African Americans in the country will be $0. So right. What Madam President is talking about is important as we create economic opportunity for African Americans and minorities throughout the nation, but particularly African Americans. And we cannot be ashamed or shy about saying that African Americans need their piece of the pie. In fact, at this time, we need the whole pie. And so we need to make sure that those investments are made. In regards to the adult expungement bill, the contrast and difference between the adult expungement bill with many of the clean slate pieces of legislation that are going on around the country, working with the Center for American Progress, Reform Alliance, and many others, is that they seal records. But the adult expungement bill actually expunged individuals' record. So prior to last year in Delaware, there was not an expungement process unless your charge was nollie-prossed. Every other charge had to go through a pardon process where the state of Delaware said you were forgiven, but it was always on your record. And so when we passed the legislation last June, Governor signed it into law in July and went into effect in December of 2019. Now in Delaware, thousands of residents now have the opportunity to have their record completely expunged other than homicide, rape, and manslaughter. but every other charge, they now have the opportunity to have their record expunged. And we have 3 criteria for that, 3 levels of that. We have a discretionary level, and then we have the pardon level, and then we have a mandatory level. So at the mandatory level, it's the lower level offenses, and then the discretionary level, you still have the opinion of the AG, the victim, and the superior court. And then at the pardon level, anyone that gets a pardon can also get their record expunged. And so that's why when we talk about our bill, it's exhaustive and more comprehensive because it's an actual expungement, whereas most states in recent years have clean slate bills that seal records, but don't actually remove it from individuals' record. And let me add this one piece. It was a bipartisan bill. So every Republican in the Delaware State Senate voted and supported this bill of this freshman state senator doing criminal justice reform. And that's because, we worked together, we got everybody around the table. Again, it's the lesson of that guy that's running for president from Delaware that taught me how to put people around the table and get people to agree and coalesce around issues. And so that example is how we were able to get things done in Delaware. And I'm sure we'll see that example in our nation's capital again real soon.
All right, well, thanks for that, Senator Brown. And the one overarching reason we want to see people records expunged is so that they can have the right to vote. A lot of the times people get these felonies and they are disenfranchised for the rest of their lives. And so one of the big moves we're seeing across the country from those that are progressive minded, and those are the type of folks that a lot of us African Americans like to support, is because they're going to go to and fight for the re-enfranchisement of African Americans. If you've paid your penalty to society, your debt to society, you should get the right to vote again. And so that's very important. That's very
right to vote and also work. So like our chamber of commerce, our association of builders and contractors, our private construction agencies all came, testified, and supported the bill because they recognized in the grain of the blue collar workforce, and they realized they need employees to be able to build roads, bridges, and infrastructure in our state. So we were able to coalesce and bring all those parties together.
Right. So the right to vote and the right to work, very much important. Any other comments? Did I hear somebody else?
Yeah, that was me. I just wanted to say we need to, on the restoration of the rights of convicted felons, we have to look at that very carefully. And I say that because, as you know, in Florida, that was on the ballot. The citizens of Florida voted to have the rights restored of convicted felons. That was some time ago. Then what happened is a Republican conservative driven legislature in Florida said, well, yeah, whatever, okay. But for them to get their rights restored, they have to pay fines, like a poll tax. And in Florida, there was no centralized, because I practiced in Florida, as I indicated before, in Mullah Gary's office, there was no centralized system for computing what the fines were. So the 1.5 million potentially people, voters in Florida, were in jeopardy, even though the people voted to have their rights restored. So we've got to take it a step further. We have to look at what the legislature is doing, what the state senators are doing when, and be mindful of that when we're voting, because they can take the will of the people and turn it around. And the reason why that became important was because those people were by and large Black and brown people who were going to vote. And this conservative effort in Florida was designed to preclude them from voting, prevent them from voting, because imagine what would have happened had some of them really been allowed to vote in the last gubernatorial election. Food for thought. So we have to monitor, and when we vote, look at what happens when we do vote, look at what the legislature does, look at our elected officials and what they're doing, and hold their feet to the fire, and then go back to the polls to let them know how we think about it.
All right, Madam President-elect is speaking with passion. She's the Election Protection Chair for the National Bar Association, and she was appointed by President Robinson, and I've had the distinction of serving as a vice chair this year. And protecting the vote is something very near and dear to her heart, and I've seen it time and time again, and we have to try to clear all of the roadblocks. They're putting them in day by day, but we have to try to clear them and get the right to vote successfully. So the road to reform, the road to equity, the road to freedom. Freedom, freedom, freedom. Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And that's something I have long believed. If I'm going to live, I'm going to live. As the NAACP said, we are done dying. As the NBA has declared, we will live. You're going to get your knee off our necks. We are going to live in this country. You brought us here. We're not going back to Africa. Despite what you may feel, we are going to stay in this country. We're going to prosper, and we are going to live. We're in a state of crisis, and there are many roadblocks to freedom, but we're going to get there. As a municipal judge in Clarksdale and Grenada, Mississippi, one roadblock to freedom for a lot of our people has been monetary bail. It's very inequitable. Poor people sit in jail because they can't afford $100 bail. The judge may only say it's $1,000. They cannot come up with $100. They sit in jail. A lot of the times, I had the pleasure or displeasure of representing someone who was in jail on petty larceny. He was picked up at 3 o'clock in the morning on petty larceny. By 7 o'clock the next morning, he was dead. And that bothers me to this day. And this was in the city of Jackson. A petty larceny, before he could even post bail, he ends up dead. And these conditions, he was shackled right there in jail. We sued the city of Jackson and got relief for the family, but a young man, 29 years of age, dead. So whenever you go before a corrupt system, whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony, you could potentially end up dead. So as a judge, most of the time now, I'm releasing people on their own recognizance. They will get to court, and we trust that they can, because rich people, they will pay the money easily and they can avoid the COVID pandemic because they're not in jail. But COVID is killing a lot of people in these jails and prisons. And so one of the things we have to propose, and I like what Mayor Bottoms did over in Atlanta, do away with monetary bail. Another thing that's has been an impediment to freedom has been these minimum sentencing guidelines, the federal minimum sentencing guidelines. So I'm bringing back our federal prosecutor, Professor Bragg, to talk about that. Do you agree with minimum sentencing, or do you think the judges should have unfettered discretion to sentence individuals?
So the research on deterrence talks about certainty of punishment and the efficiency of the process. Those are the primary considerations for deterrence, not the length of the sentence. So, where we've spent the last, really 25 years with these overly punitive measures, lengthening sentences, sometimes for relatively minor conduct, under the thought that we're getting tough on crime and we're going to stop crime. The research shows that, that it's not working. It's not the case. That's not what people are thinking about when they're in that moment. So yes, I think we need to look at, and I would sort of say it's not just a federal issue, but kind of federal and state, given that the overwhelming percentage of folks who are incarcerated are at the state and local level. And finally, I would point folks to there's some legislation pending in New York, some idea thinking, and the Professor Foreman at Yale has been, I think, leading in the academy on the idea of looking back. So not just prospectively changing the law so that we don't have mandatory minimums, but looking back at some of these sentences that are already in the books, people are already serving, and having a period of time where you look and say, okay, well, someone's been in for X amount of years. What was the goal of that sentence? Has that goal been achieved? And so that not just prospectively thinking about this situation and scaling down the size of our judicial footprint, but we have a lot of people who are in jail on these long sentences, and what can we do to look back? And so I think that's a growing movement, both in the academic literature and also in the legislative space. And we start talking about kind of 2.0 versions. I've seen some of the comments saying, what's next after this bill? I think that's something that giving prosecutors, judges the discretion to say, okay, that was the sentence then, but can we do, we're lawyers, think about a discovery clawback, right? Can we claw back that sentence? If we sit here today, 10 years later, looking back, what we have given that sentence. So I think that's another tool that needs to be in the toolkit going forward.
All right. So there's a lot of roadblocks to freedom, the sentencing, the prosecutions. I mean, sometimes it's just so blatant, especially here in Mississippi where I live. 4 years ago, In May of 2016, there was a white woman who haphazardly left her child in a hot car. That child died. We've never seen her face on the TV. She was never indicted or arrested or anything. A few weeks later, in May of 2016, a black man did the same thing here in Grenada. He was at work, forgot his child in the vehicle. That child died. He was immediately arrested, charged with second-degree murder, and put in jail on a $250,000 bond. And so one was white, one was black, 90 miles apart in the same state. He was prosecuted for manslaughter. I came to his aid, represented him pro bono, and we kept him out of prison because to me, both of them made tragic mistakes. They could never bring their children back. But if you're going to have one set of rules for the white lady, those same rules should apply for the black man. If you're going to give somebody the benefit of the doubt that was at work, it should apply to the black man as well. So we have to stand up for our people. Don't let them go down the road without a fight. And so when that prosecutor knew that we were going to fight him all the way tooth and nail, he relented, and that man is still out of prison. Didn't have to pay me a dime. And that's what we have to be there for our people, fighting and standing up for the people. Mississippi, Virginia, South Carolina, all parts of the former Confederacy. I met Wes a few years ago when we were leading a fight to bring down the state flag in Mississippi with that Confederate emblem. He's led the fight in Virginia, bringing down some Confederate statues. There's a new movement since the George Floyd killing to bring down all these Confederate statues and monuments. So Wes, can you tell me what's up with the movement now and what we need to do going forward?
Yeah, and first and foremost, I must commend Brother Carlos because his fight, although I think we all, when we're trying to remove these Confederate statues and monuments and so forth, are tough. But to see what he had to go through in Jackson, I remember coming and visiting my brother during the reopening of the Civil Rights Museum, taking a jog through the city and just seeing how blaring and apparent, how many flags there were flying throughout downtown Jackson, a city that has a significant amount of Black folk, showed the uphill battle that you had, but you've been persevering. When we look at Virginia, which is the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia being the capital of the Confederacy, and a state that is home to literally hundreds of Confederate statues or emblems of that, for that matter, we've seen a major push in regards to have these statues removed. We're a city, or excuse me, we're a commonwealth in which had a state law that prohibited these statues from being removed. That law has been amended. So that's something that people said would literally never, ever happen. When we started this fight back in 2016, in March of 2016, we had a press conference saying that we want to push to have our statues removed in Charlottesville. People told me that it would never happen. This is something that this law will never change. You all will never be able to see this through. And now we're seeing just that. We've had three cities across the state have provisions made for them to be able to remove their statues. Our governor came out last week and he is making an effort to have the largest statue in the state, a statue of Robert E. Lee in the middle of our capital, Richmond, be removed. And even here in Charlottesville, even after everything that transpired in 2017, we were sued as individual councilors in the city as a whole for an injunction for the statues to not be moved. But on July 1st, all of that will subsequently fade away and everything will move. I think, again, when you see across the country these statues being moved, that's one part of it. But the other part of it is the substantive piece. So in Charlottesville, while I wrote the resolution for the statues to be removed, I also wrote something called the equity package, which was essentially $4.5 million in resources to underserved communities. So $2.5 million for public housing redevelopment, $50,000 for GED training for anybody who lives in public housing, $50,000 for college education for anybody who lives in public housing, a position for Black youth achievement, park renovations in traditionally African-American parks and so forth, again, totaling up to nearly $4 million. I think that's where we have to move towards doing. We can address the symbols because we know that they make a huge difference, and psychologically they play a significant role, but we also have a responsibility to walk and chew gum simultaneously. So that means we have to address the substantive as well. But the only way, or not the only way, but I think a huge imperative from allowing local elected officials or state elected officials or even federal elected officials from doing so is that they don't believe they have the political will or the backing to push forward and persevere through. So in my opinion, we as a people have to encourage our specifically Black elected officials, to not be scary while they're serving. And I'm just going to call it what it is. A lot of us are governing with hopes of either getting another position or trying to get elected 2 years or 4 years later. And you can't govern and help your people by acting in that way. You have to be willing to put it on the line and sacrifice whatever it takes for us to get what we need now. Because oftentimes when we take this approach in which we're going to play a quote unquote game, we lose. If we want to win, we need to support each other and go as hard as we can in the immediate. My babies aren't looking to eat dinner 2 years from now if they can't eat lunch tomorrow. So you need to make a decision about how you're going to govern. And we as a people, again, have to support those who are looking to make these changes.
All right, well said, Dr. Bellamy. When you're talking about elected officials not being scary and having a spine and a backbone, I looked at General Ford. I definitely know this good man of Kappa Alpha Psi has a backbone. He's standing strong as the chief law enforcement officer of Nevada. And what I want to ask him is, how do we resolve this? From coast to coast, there have been people calling 911 on Black people. I mean, golfing while Black, walking while Black. I mean, going to the park while Black. I mean, everything now is criminal. If you look at a white woman the wrong way, if you ask her to do right with a dog, she's gonna call 911 on you. Can we make that criminal and get these people to stop harassing us and let us live free and enjoy our lives? What can be done about these random fake 911 calls on African Americans?
Well, I don't know if I have an elaborate answer for that. I mean, that's a complicated question, obviously involving a lot of different issues from speech to otherwise. I think what we have to do, however, is look at this dynamically. What I say in my state, we're in Nevada and we're called the Silver State. By the way, I just want to correct you, it's Nevada, not Nevada. If you come to Nevada and you say Nevada, you might get an upcharge. I'm just saying. So if you want the discount, it's Nevada. Anyway, in Nevada, you know, we are called the Silver State. And I frequently say that we live in the Silver State, but there's no silver bullet when it comes to a lot of these dynamic issues. And so it's going to take dynamic solutions to address some of these. And one of the things that it takes to address it is what we're seeing right now, and that's calling it out. That's bringing attention to folks, to the mass populace, letting them know that these are happening. And that brings to bear opportunities for change, even if it doesn't always result in change. One of the things that Dr. Bellamy just talked about was being scared. I also say that I am unabashedly unintimidated. I am impervious to the pressure that's associated with backing down from doing what's right. Do my feelings get hurt when I get attacked? Yeah. Do I like seeing people calling me anything but a child of God? Absolutely. But am I persuaded not to proceed? Absolutely not. Listen, the way I perceive this is that if the worst thing I got to do is take a couple of bad words cast my way when my forefathers survived slavery, and when my parents and grandparents had dogs sicked on them and water hoses turned on them by their own government, then the least I can do is have some thicker skin relative to some of the castigations that are being directed toward me. And so what I always say is I would always speak truth to power, especially from my position of power. Because if I don't, it's a wasted opportunity to effect real change during an opportunity when I have it. You know, I remember when I received once what I considered to be a veiled threat at challenging my election, my next election during when I was in the Senate. There was a controversial bill being considered, and someone said something that I perceived as them saying they were going to challenge my election. And my response to them was, if the worst thing you're going to do is send me home to my wife and kids to spend more time with them, then you're doing me a favor. And I proceeded to vote on that bill, to process that bill in the way that was fair and appropriate. And that bill exists today in a way that's saving lives. And so what we need to be able to do is to be bold in our leadership, unabashedly, unintimidated, and speak out on issues. So when it comes to these fake 911 calls, call them out. You know, when it comes to folks lying on you or you know, otherwise dehumanizing you, then we need to be able to respond to that. And listen, I can get as animated as anybody else. You know, I can get, I'm 6'3", 6'4", and I can be perceived as having that angry black man syndrome. Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? And so I have learned how to have a conversation, I believe, in a way that can be received in the way intended. But even if it is not my responsibility, nor do I view it as a task of mine to either challenge you or to make you feel comfortable. What my job is to try to effectuate real positive change, to bring about equality for everyone, recognizing that systemic racism exists as a direct remnant of the most racist system that our country has known. And I'm going to do all that I can under all of the circumstances you've just described, including 911 phone calls, to call those out and try to rectify those.
All right, we appreciate you being in that position, General Ford. You're one of 4 African-American attorney generals across this great country of ours. And
let me say to you as well. We have 7 of us.
7?
5 are Democrats, 2 are Republicans. So we're 14% of the attorneys general being represented are represented by people of color. And we've done as much as we can cumulatively to work together. Sometimes we don't always see eye to eye, but nonetheless, we do proceed.
Okay. We know of the one in DC. We know of the one in New York, Minnesota, Nevada,
Illinois. Virgin Islands. Those are the Democrats. And then you have 2 Republicans, one in Indiana and one in Kentucky.
Okay. All right. And I believe the one in Illinois is another member of Kappa Alpha Psi, so we're very represented.
You are.
All right. We got about 5 minutes left, and we're going to take some questions from the audience. I see 29 questions. We will not get to all of those. We have a distinguished panel, so we're going to answer some of these questions. I'll throw them out to the panelists. I did want to make mention of Paul Howard and A.G. Ellison over in Minnesota, Paul Howard in Atlanta, who are doing great jobs as prosecutors and having the backbone. They have the intestinal fortitude to get what needs to be done in the instances of George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks. And so I've been very proud of these men. They are getting the death threats and all the angry words, but they are not changing course. I definitely applaud those individuals. So Joe St. George is asking, is the prohibition of the chokehold without exception, and what are the consequences if an officer does engage the use of chokehold? Does the officer get fired? Is there civil liability, monetary damages, or any criminal liability? So which one of our prosecutors wants, any lawyer want to answer that question?
I can speak to the legislation, certainly in New York State. Just last week, we criminalized, our state legislature did, the use of a chokehold. So it's a criminal provision. A number of jurisdictions already, police departments, I think including Minneapolis, have, actually I don't know about Minneapolis, but certainly in New York here, have made it administrative and employment consequence can flow. But the development that I think is very consequential here in New York and that the federal legislation contemplates is making it a criminal act. So, not leaving it up to an administrative process that may be governed by a police union, city contract, but having criminal consequences for the use of a chokehold.
And typically I can just add that a lot of times there is civil liability attached to police misconduct. So you cannot, and if it results in death, you can always file a wrongful death action. If there's an excessive use of force, you can always file charges in that vein. But it certainly does help if there's police reform that would ensure, give a vehicle or a vessel for citizens who are victims to be able to prosecute or to go after the police, not have the state go after them or the feds go after them, but also private citizens in a civil context.
And let me offer this as a quick tangent.
That's a very important.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go
ahead.
Just as a quick tangent, I can't speak to the current iteration of the federal bill, but what I would say is this, closely associated with this chokehold and police practicing what might be perceived as, or might actually be abusive tactics, is this duty to intervene that many police departments here in our own state already have on the books, and one implemented in the immediate wake and aftermath of the George Floyd killing. The duty to intervene is interesting because, there's a police saying out there, if you see something, say something. They want us to snitch, if you will, on people that we see something happening, but they are loath to snitch on themselves and on one another. I think this duty to intervene is something that if strictly enforced, and if the policies are enforced and discipline takes place, if leading up to and including firing, we will start to see police officers being a bit more appropriate in their interactions with folks, because they're fellow cops who, and cops always say, we in law enforcement say, no one hates a bad cop better more than a good cop. Well, the good cops need to tell on the bad cops, and there needs to be a consequence associated with that as well.
All right. Well, we're running out of time. We have about a minute left. It's 1:29. I would like to thank all of the panelists for being here, but I do want us to end on this note and remember the Breonna Taylor case in Kentucky. That's a sad case of a woman who was killed because the police exercised the no-knock warrant. First of all, I don't know why the judge signed it, but a no-knock warrant at a home where Breonna Taylor lived. She was an EMT. They were looking for a man. They thought he was at her home, and they went in there, bullets blazing, and they killed Breonna, and then they arrested the guy, and he found out he was not even the right person they were looking for. So Breonna Taylor's killers have not come to justice. They have not been arrested. Keep that family in your prayers, and let's put some pressure on the prosecutor there in Kentucky to arrest those killers as well. I mean, the people have been charged in the George Floyd instance. They've been charged in Rayshard Brooks, but Breonna Taylor still has not gotten into justice. So remember her and her family in your prayers and thoughts. And I appreciate each of the distinguished panelists, Madam President, Madam President-elect, General Ford, Senator Brown, Professor Bragg, and Dr. Bellamy. And of course, our opening keynote speaker was Congressman Jeffries. It's been my pleasure to serve you today as your moderator. I'm Judge Carlos Moore signing out, and I will turn it back over to our distinguished president.
Thank you all, panelists, moderator, and of course, the representative. This has been extraordinary. This has been a great, great panel. I thank Carlos Moore for putting it together, and I just let him go, and then, we'll pull him back when he went too far. You know what I'm trying to say. Anyway, I thank him so much, because he really did the lion's share of putting this together with Alvin and all the rest of you, so that your expertise, I was taking notes and had to put on my glasses and type. It's really, really been great. Let me end with two things. First of all, I invite you to join the National Bar Association. The National Bar Association is where you get more of this free knowledge, where you can find a comfortable place where, as we say, you're in your skin. And that we're also, we have all kinds of folks and all kinds of issues. It's predominantly African-American, but not exclusively. We've got some of our white brothers and sisters who are hanging in there with us and have done so for years. So we invite you to join. Go to our website and you'll see all the things that we're doing and how you can support us even if you don't join. And then I'll end with this. Why must we have reform? Because all of us, each one of us, could be the next victim. You may have escaped before. I escaped. If I had not escaped, I would be the Miss Taylor. And I'll talk about that in another time. But we have to look at this and know that we should be able to enjoy this nation. We should be able to drive what kind of car we want to drive. We should be able to walk where we want to walk. We should be able to jog when we want to. We should be able to vote when we want to. We should be able to say what we want to. And we should be able to protest peacefully and speak truth to power. With that, we'll end our time together. And I wish you Godspeed and be safe and socially distanced.
President Robinson, one other thing, this was co-sponsored by the Metropolitan Black Bar Association of New York, and that's probably why we have a lot of New Yorkers represented. So we appreciate them for being our co-sponsor this afternoon.
Thank you very much for co-sponsoring.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Happy Juneteenth.